Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel today. Yes, you are reading the title correctly. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament. You might say that you have a few versions of the Dead Sea Scrolls at home and you've never seen a New Testament fragment included in the collection. And I understand that's where I stand. But what if I told you that it was on purpose, that it was not included in the collection of scrolls that you have for a reason? What if I told you that there was at least one cave that included books from the New Testament? Well, today you are in for a big surprise. Believe me, I was so happy to find this information out that I went off the beaten path last week. And I owe this to a subscriber. You know who you are. So he pointed me in this direction, and let me tell you, I have not looked back since. So I'm running with this information because it's been hidden. Of course, I try to expose what has been hidden. No one is really talking about this. So what I need to do is the next best thing, and that is to shine a light in the darkness. So this path will lead us all, hopefully, to have more tools in our belt for those deniers. All right, there is a gentleman here by the name of Bill Cooper. He was vice president and trustee of the creation science movement in England. He also served as adjunct professor of providential history and apologetics on the master faculty at the Institute for Creation. Now, he has since passed. However, he leaves behind some great books that seem to be not widely distributed. His works are not revered by many groups or people, and I'm about to expose the reason why his information has been pushed under a rug. So if you followed my channel, you know that I find these people who go against the grain. Well, I'm going to say that Bill Cooper went against the grain when researching in this topic, and he wrote a book called The Authenticity of the New Testament Fragments from Qumran. You will not find this book in print anywhere. You can only get it in a digital copy. And I found it on Amazon.com. And again, there's nothing else. There's nothing else out there. I can't find it anywhere, only in digital form. All right, so let's take a look at his book. Here is a picture of it. And while I truly want to read the whole book, I don't want to get a copyright infringement. So here is the introduction that is available from Amazon. The words from Bill Cooper. So I'm going to read this. In 1955, there were discovered several papyrus fragments in Qumran Cave 7. The unusual and unexpected feature of Cave 7 was that all of its fragments were in Greek, as opposed to exclusively Hebrew and Aramaic scrolls that had been found in the other caves. Apart from two of the fragments, which were from the Greek version of the Old Testament, Exodus and the apocryphal letter of Jeremiah, the rest of the fragments from Cave 7 were all cataloged as unidentified and were considered indeed to be unidentifiable. That's how things remained until 1972, when the petrologist Dr. Jose O'Callahan thought that he would try to identify them. They were housed at the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, and in April 1972, he was able to do a hands-on examination of each of them and take a series of infrared and other photographs. What he discovered concerning them was to shock the academic world. The fragments belong to the book of the New Testament. Why that should have shocked the world of academia was this. The cave and its fragments were sealed up in the year AD 68 when the Roman 10th Legion overran the area. This means that these New Testament books had been written out before that year and were indeed copied out of earlier exemplars. It means that the New Testament had been written out and was in circulation well before the eyewitnesses period of AD 30 to 70. In other words, it undermines everything, and I mean everything, that the Bible critics have been saying for the past couple of hundred of years or so. This is evidence which tells us that our New Testament is no collection of fables written out so late that they are worthless, but a thoroughly authentic eyewitness account of the man of Yeshua and the son of Elohim. It is time for the fragments from Qumran Cave 7 to speak for themselves once again. Pretty exciting. All right. It's going to get more exciting. So, who is Jose O'Callahan? Well, he was a Spanish theology educator, ordained priest in, yes, the Roman Catholic Church, 1952. He was a member of the International Papyrologist Association. In other words, he studied papyrus. So some might say, well, he's a Jesuit priest, so how can we trust him? Well, this man, although in a field we might not trust as much, lost his credibility, and he was mocked when he exposed what we are about to read today. He did write a book on what was found in Cave 7 called the Cueva, the Cave 7 of Qumran. Okay, so as you can see here, there were several caves found. 7 is mentioned, and it's right here. 7 through 10, right in this area. So, what was found in Cave 7? So, I scoured the web for information on Cave 7, and it always came up short. They're going to tell you that they found Baruch 6, or just that everything was pretty unidentifiable, right? So, here is something. Let me get this pulled up. This is something that I found when looking up, for example, Wikipedia. It's talking about what was found in Cave 7, and it says that there are fewer than 20 fragments found. Here's some pictures of it. And these documents included the letter of Jeremiah, which is Baruch 6. And then it talks about much speculation in later decades. And then it says, and perhaps, a Greek copy of the Scroll of Enoch. Well, what's interesting is that's all the information you're going to find right there. Okay? That's really it. And then, if you keep looking, hey, maybe there's some other sources out there. What else are we going to find? Yeah, you're not going to find anything. Here was another one that I found. Biblical Archaeology Society. What do they say that was found in Cave 7? Let's take a look here. Cave 7. Septuagint Exodus, Epistle of Jeremiah, question mark, unclassified, imprint. And we'll get on to that imprint in just a minute. So they're really telling you that nothing was really found in this cave, which I find very interesting. And you're going to see why. So we have O'Callahan, who produces his work on what he finds, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. But then we also have another gentleman, and his name is Karsten Peter Thiede, and he is a German, was a German archaeologist of the New Testament. And Karsten Thiede confirms Callahan's work, and he also wrote on the subject, and his book is called The Jesus Papyrus. So he confirms the same thing Callahan confirms. So we're going to take a look at what they're confirming and what they're finding. So first things first is we need to learn a term, and this term is called Textus Receptus. So here is what Cooper says about it and why it plays a role in what we're going to look at today. So the Textus Receptus is called, or is termed, the received text. It was long regarded among scholars, and rightly so, as the original Greek text of the New Testament. Afterwards exonerated by more than 5,000 early manuscript witnesses, it was published in print by Robert Stevens in 1550, and was the text from which all the Reformation Bibles of England and Europe up to the King James Bible were translated. Under the hand of Elohim, it went around the world, and is still loved and cherished by millions today. But, here's the but, herein lies the value of the New Testament fragments from Qumran Cave 7. They are all, without exception, from Textus Receptus. There is very good reason for this. They are all sealed in Cave 7 by the year AD 68. That is 2 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, and hence some years before the invention of the Alexandrian distortions of the scriptures. In other words, the fragments represent the New Testament in its original state. Okay, so keep that in mind when we look at what's next. Here is the find. So in 1972, Dr. O'Callaghan arrived in Jerusalem, and apparently he had no idea what was about to happen with his finds. He thought he was just going there to identify some Old Testament books, anything from, Exodus, the Pentateuch, anything, right? He was just going to identify those things. He found that this was not from the Old Testament. So again, many of you will probably say, oh, it's a Rockefeller Museum. Well, they hold everything, right? They house everything. They have everything under lock and key, right? But we're going to take a look at what they're hiding from us. Let's take a look at the find. Okay, again, I'm quoting Cooper here. Ironically, O'Callaghan, who first identified the fragments as belonging to the New Testament, and Theed, who defended O'Callaghan's identifications throughout the 1990s and into the new millennium, used the critical text, as they called it, and not the Textus Receptus as the basis of their reconstructions. Perhaps they thought that the scholars wouldn't listen to them if they used the received text. The irony here, however, is the fact that their identifications were entirely correct. Although it did lead to one or two minor errors in the dichotomy of their reconstructions, where these occur, we have nitpickingly corrected them by supplying the dichotomy from Textus Receptus, which is always an improvement in accuracy. So, we have in the New Testament fragments from Cave 7 not only vital witnesses to the early writing and the publication of the books of the New Testament during the eyewitness period of AD 30 to 70, many decades before the critics would have us believe they were written, but witnesses also of sheer antiquity and originality of the received text. It wasn't something dreamed up centuries later, as Allen and colleagues have always taught, but was there at the beginning, written out during the eyewitness period, the very words of Elohim, which inspired and were given to the New Testament writers. That is why these fragments are worth studying and preserving. They simply could not be more important. So what was found? Oh, it's amazing. Fragments from 1 Timothy 3:16 through 4:3, Mark 6:52 through 53, Mark 4:28, Acts 27:38, Mark 12:17, James 1:23 through 24, Romans 5:11 through 12, 2 Peter 1:15, Mark 6:48, and my favorite part, a commentary on Romans. Oh, that's my favorite part, and we'll get into that in a little bit. All right, so what happened was O'Callaghan found these fragments, and he tried to match, any biblical document known to mankind, right, from the Old Testament, or any scrolls, or something else, maybe some papyrus that he, had heard about. But when he came back empty-handed, he had a hunch, and he tried to connect them with the New Testament, and his find turned into astonishment, right? So now, I personally don't know Greek, but what it looks like is it's just written in what we would call a run-on sentence. So apparently his first find was at the end of a sentence, and apparently that makes it a lot easier to trace than finding something from the middle of a document. So he had something like this. This is what he found. One letter here, couple letters here. On the third line, he found these letters, and on the fourth line, he found these letters. So again, it was at the end of the piece of papyri, and so it was at the edge. And so what he needed to do was figure out what verses from the Bible would match these words at the end. And he was able to put those little pieces. So here is fragment 1, and he was able to put it here. And fragment 2, he was able to put it here. And so he's able to put these into sentences, but those sentences happen to be from the New Testament. Okay, so his first find was simple. It was easier to trace. And now again, I don't know. He says it's simple. Looks confusing to me, but again, I don't know Greek, so I just take his word for it. But I don't want to give it all away. But this is where he was able to match 1 Timothy 3:16 through 4:3 was just by these little fragments. Okay, so O'Callaghan goes on to find these documents from the Gospels, Acts, and letters from Paul. And what is significant about these finds? Let's take a look at what Mr. Cooper says here. At the time this fragment was written out, the book of Acts was surprisingly new. It is estimated that Luke wrote Acts in AD 66, which means that this copy of Acts was made within only a year of the original's completion. This is hugely embarrassing for the critics. Suffice it here to say that the solitary and single fact of Luke's Acts being discovered amongst the other New Testament books in a cave that was sealed up in AD 68 is alone sufficient to demolish their nonsense. That is the value of Qumran Cave's 7 fragments. There is simply no arguing with them. So it couldn't have been written later, folks. That means it had to have been written before the cave was closed up, right? They can't open the cave and put stuff back in it. That didn't happen. So it obviously had to be written before the cave was closed up. And it was in circulation. All right. Along with other fragments, it shows the certain presence of the Christian scriptures at Qumran at a time when, according to the critics, they should not have existed. And so they testify against everything that the critics have always claimed. According to the critics, nothing but Old Testament and related texts are found at Qumran. And the admission that the Christian texts are also to be found there would mean that the rewriting of the whole libraries and the loss of many reputations of those who wrote them. But there it is. Facts are facts. Are facts. Bill Cooper. I hope you guys are as excited about this as I am. This is exciting. Okay, this is the next one, Romans 5:11 through 12. This is Bill Cooper stating, perhaps the greatest point of interest concerning this fragment is not just the presence in the cave of Paul's letters to Romans, which he'd written in AD 58 in any case, a full 10 years before Qumran Cave 7 was sealed, but the fact that in the cave there was stored a document that has every appearance of being a commentary on Romans. We'll see that in just a little bit. Chapter 12 of the book. It signifies most powerfully how pivotal Paul's letters to the Romans was and still is to establishing the new covenant doctrine of salvation through grace by faith. That needed to be clearly explained to the early church, both Jew and Gentile, and it is interesting to see that commentaries were employed so early to achieve that end. So what he's saying is that this information was written early, not later, but early, and put in this cave. Now, it's also stating that there is a commentary that's found in the cave also. So how do you have a commentary on something that's written if it hasn't been written. Does that make sense? Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, 2 Peter. But why is it so exciting to find 2 Peter preserved in Cave 7? For this one glorious reason. 2 Peter is the one book of the New Testament that critics really do insist is of late composition, written so far beyond the close of the eyewitness period that to even connect it to Peter is ridiculous. It is pseudonymous, nothing more than a pious forgery written years, perhaps hundreds of years or more. So he's quoting what all these critics are telling us, right? So even hundreds of years or more after Peter was dead. With delicious irony, 2 Peter says more in condemnation about false teachers than any other book of the New Testament. So the critics' insistence on its worthlessness begins to border on the comical. But the added irony is surely the discovery of the fragment of 2 Peter in a cave which was sealed up within the eyewitness period of AD 30 to 70. A fragment, moreover, that belonged not to Peter's original second letter, but to a copy of it doubtless made from even earlier exemplars. Though by how many removes we cannot know, it upends everything that the critics have always taught on the matter. Conservative scholars and Bible apologists have labored against the critics on this for centuries, but to no avail. Yet, the job is done to perfection by a tiny fragment of papyrus which was providentially preserved in Cave 7. Elohim never, ever leaves himself without a witness. Critics, take note. I love his attitude about this. All right, this is one of my favorite parts. The papyrus of 7Q19 was actually found as an imprint on the ground. It was found as a transferred image on the floor of the cave. But that's not even the most impressive part. This commentary on Romans, from Paul, that's what makes it even more exciting to me. Let me read this here. It says, now the ramifications of this are immense, truly immense. We know from the presence of fragment 7Q9 in Cave 7 that Paul's letter to the Romans, which was some 10 years old by 68 AD, was known and used by whoever placed the New Testament scrolls in the cave. And by the presence and nature of 7Q19 in that cave, we know that Paul's Romans was not only read, drum roll please, but it was studied and studied in depth. Folks, not only were letters from Paul found in the caves, but there were commentaries on it. That means these scribes knew the importance of Paul's letters and they were writing about it. And we know that Peter tells us that Paul was hard to understand. These scribes were writing commentaries on Paul because they also knew he was hard to understand. But they found his words beneficial for us, that they were writing and rewriting. They were copying and distributing this information. Folks, Paul is not a false teacher. Those in the Qumran community, the Zadokite priests, valued Paul's writings. And this is proof. This brought me to tears, not only just finding Romans and Timothy in the caves. I mean, that's a feat all of its own. But folks, this is so amazing. So amazing. Again, I hope you're holding on to your seats. This is so exciting. At least it is to me. I hope you are as excited as I am. Okay, so here it says a commentary on Romans. So critics, of course, have trouble accepting that any of the New Testament books had been written by 68 AD. So they now have to explain how it comes about that commentaries existed on those books even before that date. No man can offer comments on books which have not yet been written, So even if 7Q19 had been the only fragment found in the Cave 7, we would know by its existence that at least one New Testament book, namely Romans, had been written and put into circulation beforehand. Think about that. Amazing. Okay, this is the not so amazing part. When interested parties wanted more excavations on this and they wanted to study more information from Cave 7, they found it an interesting situation. They found that Cave 7 had apparently collapsed. This cave had been untainted for thousands of years, yet when the New Testament finds were made, it mysteriously fell apart for no apparent reason. This is quite interesting, right? As this has never happened to any other cave over there. Let's see what Bill Cooper says about this. It is a matter of historical record that O'Callahan's 1972 announcement to the world that the cave contained New Testament documents caused an unholy furor. A great many people were deeply angered by it. They still are. And so, too, were many great powerful institutions, anti-Christian institutions around the world who have worked for decades to bring down the New Testament and discredit it utterly in the public's eyes. There were lively fears and suspicions among them that the cave could yield yet more evidence for the pre-AD 68 antiquity of the New Testament. Hopeful expectations that were still being voiced by the Eichstätt Symposium as late as 1991, even after the cave was no more. So again we ask, what or who was responsible for the cave's destruction? What are your thoughts? My thoughts? I cannot stress how exciting this book is. I think everyone, and I mean everyone, should buy this book. I cannot do it justice by just quoting a few things. I also don't want to give it all away. I believe that this is important for those critics. You probably know those critics. We all know someone who criticizes Paul. Why, oh why, would the Zadokites have several copies of not only the New Testament Gospels, but Paul's account as well, if they thought his teachings were falsehood? There were commentaries of all sorts found there. They were explaining Paul's tough words, as Peter cautioned us about. They knew his words needed to be explained. All of this was put away before 70 AD. The Gospels were written and distributed before 100 AD, which is what we are being told. We are told that there were unknown authors who wrote these accounts down for us. And I'm calling it hogwash. And here is the bona fide proof. Here is proof that Paul was legitimate in the eyes of those in Qumran. We know Mr. O'Callahan and Mr. Cooper are rarely in print because of the elites, the powers that be. They do not want this information to get out. They want people left in the dark. So my thought to you is to help bring this back into the light by purchasing this book. All right, everyone, join me next time. And if you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and most of all, please share. All right, this needs to be shared. Be blessed, everyone.